it so is not for me. Looks like we've got the recording going now. Again, welcome to our Totem Top 10 series, and thanks again to the Ohio SBDC and PTAC for giving us Totem Technologies the opportunity to come in and talk about something we're super passionate about. This is our basic cybersecurity hygiene series, and my name is Nathan. I'm a cybersecurity engineer with Totem Tech, and during this series, we discuss the 10 most important cybersecurity safeguards for lowering your cybersecurity risk. My contact information is on the bottom of the screen there. Should you have an interest in contacting me, you can email me or feel free to connect with me on LinkedIn. We do have actually, I'm not sharing my screen, that would help. Okay, let's try that again. Welcome to our Totem Top 10. My contact information is down in the bottom there. Feel free to get a hold of me if you would like, now that you can actually see how to get a hold of me. Couple housekeeping items real quick. We do have a chat and a Q&A feature enabled in this. Feel free to type your questions in either area. I am monitoring both. So type them in at any time and I will be sure to get to those. Today, we're going to be talking about user training. Last week, we discussed how knowing your assets, our very first control in the Totem Top 10, is the first step in creating a cybersecurity program. But today, we're going to move to our second step, which is to train your users. We're going to begin with a discussion on why humans, your employees, are the biggest hurdle that your organization will have to overcome if it is serious about its cybersecurity. Then we're going to take a look at the importance of building what we would call a cybersecurity culture and what this means in the context of user training. And finally, we're going to talk about what sorts of threats and cybersecurity best practices that your users need to be aware of, and how just by knowing these things, you can turn your users from effectively your most dangerous asset into your strongest defense. Looks like my audio messed up. Change that real fast. Okay, sorry about that. Hopefully you can all still hear me okay. Looks like audio is coming through. Sorry about that. Wouldn't be a Totem presentation without a little technical difficulties, but I think we're okay. Sounds good to me. Thanks, Adam. All right. We have two more free tools that we're going to be showing you this morning: our computer incident response aid and our IT acceptable use policy. I'm going to be showing you these in depth when we get to those, but be on the lookout for those. Now, this control is probably my favorite to talk about. And I think it's really because most people don't really understand how effective this control really is. There are lots of companies out there who are actively trying to sell you some, cybersecurity related product, maybe an antivirus or some really expensive piece of hardware, and they're claiming that this product is the magic bullet to protecting your organization. And although these products may be helpful, I hope to show you today that there really is no substitute for cybersecurity user training. When we are equipping our users with the knowledge and the tools to be able to identify and prevent threats, cyber threats, we become a really tough organization to compromise. So that's our goal this morning. I hope that this series interests you and that you can walk away from this with some helpful tools, some helpful ideas that you can immediately begin to implement in your own organization. Before we start, though, I did want to highlight an interesting news article I read recently that you guys might find interesting. Ransomware is an extremely hot topic in cybersecurity and information technology in day-to-day business operations nowadays. And it should be, honestly, ransomware is something we're going to talk a little bit about today, but it's extremely dangerous, is extremely costly for businesses that succumb to a ransomware attack. And I just want to show you sort of the state of ransomware right now. So this article, more like a blog, was published by CrowdStrike, a pretty well-known cybersecurity organization, just 2 days ago, excuse me. And within the last couple years or so, this thing called ransomware as a service has appeared. If you've heard of like software as a service, it's like that exact same idea, but instead applied to ransomware. It's a business model between ransomware operators and affiliates, in which the affiliates will actually pay someone selling the ransomware to use their ransomware in their attacks on, different targets. And so this is essentially this model, it is a business model now. It's what it's grown to, is it is allowing adversaries, even like the adversaries who don't really know what they're doing, to pay minute amounts of money, in this case around like $40 a month, to get a hold of an incredibly dangerous, incredibly nasty piece of ransomware, and then to go, infect whoever they want. And in this case, CrowdStrike's reporting that the average ransomware demand in 2021 was around $6 million. Do you think that there's significant incentive for adversaries to get on board with this? I would say so. I mean, you're only spending $40 a month, and potential yield is $6 million. I mean, there is an extreme incentive for the bad guys to get into this sort of stuff. And the reality is, when it comes to ransomware, when it comes to really cyber threats as a whole, is the bad guys are looking to improve their tactics. They are not slowing down by any means. And so on the flip side of that, neither should those of us who are looking just to protect ourselves. And this is the reality of what we are up against, is we are up against a booming industry with, constantly innovating business models. And it's a little scary, it's a little intimidating, and it's a little overwhelming, especially for the small business who may not have even the most basic cybersecurity safeguards in place. And so this sort of gives some reason to our Totem Top 10 series, hopefully, that we need to, at the very least, have a robust cybersecurity program. We need to have our users trained and equipped to identify cyber threats to protect us from really nasty things like this. So I'll stick this link in the chat if you want. I would encourage you to give it a read and make sure I'm sending this to everyone. Yep. Give this a read at some point if you'd like, just to understand the implications of the current threat landscape and what it means for your small business. So anyways, back into the presentation. I thought you guys might find that interesting. Quick review before we jump back in to our second control. Over the last couple of weeks, we have discussed a number of important topics. First is that small businesses are prime targets for hackers. We've discussed why small businesses tend to be a little too overconfident when it comes to their cybersecurity, and that we tend to maybe rely on old habits. We tend to rely on hardware or software that is not secure. And we ultimately just sort of cross our fingers that nothing bad will happen to us, because we've sort of developed this idea that, oh, hackers only care about the big businesses. That's where all the money is there. They probably won't take an interest in me. And we debunked that myth and instead highlighted the urgency for small businesses to recognize and that we are prime targets for hackers. We also discussed why cybersecurity as a whole can be boiled down to risk management. There are simply way too many threats, way too many vulnerabilities out there to be able to protect ourselves against all of these things perfectly. It'd be way too expensive, and small businesses don't have the resources to do so. So instead, we take what's called a defense in depth approach, meaning that we employ many different cybersecurity safeguards and sort of layer them together to lower our cybersecurity risk. And so our sort of beginner's approach to defense in depth is the Totem Top 10. And to measure the effectiveness of the Totem Top 10, I demonstrated in week 1 an actual phishing attempt that we received a few years ago, and what would have happened if a user had clicked on the invoice.doc attachment you see there. And throughout the course of this series, we're going to be, in the context of each control, referring back to this phishing email and talk about how that specific control could have played a part in preventing this phishing attempt from being successful. As we discussed last week, the very first thing that you need to do as it relates to basic cybersecurity hygiene is you need to know your IT system assets. More specifically, you need to take an account of all of the IT system hardware, the software, the sensitive information that is being facilitated by that hardware and software, and you need to capture this in some sort of an IT system inventory. And this is the building block to building a cybersecurity program. So before you do anything else, before you start training your users like we're going to talk about today, I'd highly encourage you to go to our free tools page and grab yourself a copy of our system inventory template and start building out your IT system inventory. Everything else in this Totem Top 10 is predicated on how well you know your assets. So I encourage you to go do that. In fact, let me throw the link. This is our free tools page, as you can see. Lots of free resources here. I'll throw the link in the chat. I hope this is some help to you. All right. So this is where we stand so far in our Totem Top 10 series. I mentioned week 1 that the first and second control, know your assets and train your users respectively, should be done in that order. You should first know your assets, then you should start training your users. But the other 8 controls that we're going to be talking about over the next several weeks can be done really in whatever order your business sees fit. But it's especially important that you do these first 2 controls in order. Before I get into the how you should train your users, I figured I would start with an explanation of the why you should train your users. We all need cybersecurity user training because, well, it's our users that are the reason most attacks are successful. Look at these first 2 statistics I have on the screen here. Excuse me, according to Verizon, 85% of data breaches were due to the human element. The human element, my interpretation of that, meaning that an attack would not be able to continue without some sort of interaction or contribution from a human. something like a phishing email and someone clicking on it without the human actually interacting with that link or that attachment, the phishing attack would do nothing. And so in some step along the way, a human interacted with some attack and most likely unintentionally caused it to be successful. And then second, over 90% of cyber attacks start with a phishing email. These may not come as a surprise to you because we hear about phishing and data breaches a lot when we talk about cybersecurity, but there's a reason we talk about them, and that's because it's the human element that gives hackers, that gives attackers, adversaries, whatever title you want to give them, the greatest chance for success. And hackers will still target the technology, they'll still target your networks and stuff and attempt to exploit these pieces of technology, but this is typically after they have already tried to exploit an actual human within your company. Some other disturbing facts of interest that I figured I'd share. On average, North American users post about 25% click rate, meaning roughly 1 in 4 users will click on a phishing email when they receive one. That's awful. That's not good. I honestly expected it to be higher, but that's still pretty crazy. Like, just think about if your company has 100 employees, according to this, roughly 25 of them will click on a phishing email if it's sent to them, giving an adversary that many opportunities to breach your network. So pretty scary, super concerning in my opinion. So at the end of the day, we are, when I say we, us humans are the reason that most attacks are successful. But on the flip side of that, I would say that also means that that's the reason why most attacks cannot be successful, is because of humans. If we're the reason that they can be, maybe we can also be the reason that they aren't. And so let's get into that discussion of what that could look like. So it's up to us, it's up to our humans, our employees, to be our strongest defense and not our biggest weakness. But where do we even start with this? Well, unfortunately, that's going to depend on what your organization and likely upper management decides. But I can tell you that what the end goal ought to be, and that's to establish a cybersecurity culture. Let's see, question. Certificate training. I want to receive lecture documents. No, we do not offer certifications. We do user and administrator training or basic cybersecurity training, but we do not offer certifications. No. Great question, because certifications are an important part of user training, although specifically for professionals. In this case, we are focused on basic cybersecurity hygiene, so cybersecurity that applies to all aspects of an organization. Although certifications are important, we got to keep our other users in mind who may not be IT associates or, etc. No, we do not provide certifications. I hold a certification, but we do not, as a company, provide it. So hopefully that answers your question. Back to creating a cybersecurity culture, the term cybersecurity culture is thrown around a lot, and it has become, in my opinion, somewhat romanticized. But I actually really like the idea, although we never really explain what it means or what it entails. And to start, I would say that a cybersecurity culture is really just analogous to a safety culture. The whole point of cybersecurity is to protect us and our information. So we would think that such a culture would be centered around safety. However, this is going to take some time because you should assume that your users know very little about cybersecurity, and Therefore, your business leaders and your IT staff, they have a responsibility to train them. Okay, train them, sure, but train them on what? Well, we're going to talk about that. We're going to talk more about on a surface level what all of your users need to be educated on when it comes to just the most basic risks, threats, and just cybersecurity best practices that we would recommend that your users be aware of. Keep in mind that one crucial element of a cybersecurity culture is that it is a collective effort. Most businesses, unfortunately, just rely on their IT department for all of their cybersecurity. And although the IT staff certainly should be among the leaders in this culture you're trying to build, they cannot bear the entire burden of cybersecurity. Your IT technician just cannot always be there to prevent your CEO from, clicking on that phishing email, or from stopping that warehouse associate from letting a fake UPS associate into the building, right? The best way to mitigate risk in this case would be to always treat cybersecurity as every user's responsibility, although our IT team and our upper management bear the responsibility for doing the training. Additionally, in order for a cybersecurity culture to actually work, it needs to start from the top and it needs to flow down from there. Your executives, your business managers, they must be your greatest advocates for cybersecurity. Let me provide just a brief example. I see that my colleague Adam Austin is on this call. Adam recently led a NIST 800-171 and CMMC workshop for YSU. And so you may have had the chance to hear from Adam and interact with him. Adam is the cybersecurity lead and also my boss. But one of the reasons that our organization has been able to build our own really effective cybersecurity culture is because of Adam's leadership. He's in the C-suite and also the strongest advocate for cybersecurity on our team. And so when the rest of us, see his leadership and his push for cybersecurity, we listen. And the same can be true of your staff. Your employees are far more likely to get on board with this idea of a cybersecurity culture if they are hearing it from above. If your strongest advocate is not an executive or a leader within your organization, it's going to make doing this a lot more difficult. So keep that in mind. But obviously, with cybersecurity being a collective effort, not only is it going to require help from the top, but it's also going to require employee buy-in. You may need to go to great lengths to show your employees why they are to adopt this culture. And we'll talk more about this on the next slide, but keep in mind that everything here when it comes to a culture boils down to how well your users buy into this process. There are lots of tools, technologies, services out there that you can find that can that you could potentially outsource to help you with achieving your defense in depth. But at the end of the day, it boils down to your company that is responsible for putting this plan into place. Cybersecurity is not something you can just outsource and put on someone else's shoulders. Your company has a responsibility to get your employees on board with the idea and make this actually happen instead of just paying someone else to do it. So last point for creating a cybersecurity culture is that it really only works if defense in depth is in place. And again, this idea behind defense in depth is instead of relying on one, maybe two, maybe three sources of of defense, could be technology, could be something else. Instead of that, we are using many different safeguards and sort of layering them together. And where if any one of those safeguards fails, we have another one to step up and take its place. And so that's just the idea behind defense in depth again. And so we need that approach in order for a cybersecurity culture to actually work. I do think that there is a reason why companies that rely heavily on technology for their cybersecurity, or maybe one specific solution that is not user training, are also those with the most poorly trained users, and as a result succumb to the most phishing emails or whatever. But on the other hand, if you only relied on your users and did not incorporate any defensive technology, you're still quite vulnerable. And so we need this defense in depth approach to make this culture work. But I want to make it clear that we want defense in depth, but our trained users should be leading the way in this approach, in this culture. And so I mentioned technology, that's part of this approach. We're going to, starting next week, begin to look at the technology that you'd want to incorporate. We're going to start with software whitelisting next week. But again, the end goal with cybersecurity, with user training, is we are trying to create a cybersecurity culture within our organization. Okay, so hopefully by this point, you're on board with the idea that it's your executives and your business leaders and your IT staff who must be leading the way in creating a cybersecurity culture. At this point, I'd like to start thinking through ways that can encourage employee buy-in, getting employees on board with the idea of a cybersecurity culture. I'd love to hear your thoughts on this in a few minutes as to what sort of ideas your company may have with getting employees on board, what things you've tried. I'd love to hear some ideas that you guys have. We'll get to that in a moment. I'd first like to share what we've found success with, not saying that this is going to work for everyone, but some items that have worked for us. First, you really should make it clear to your users that they are the most important factor when it comes to cybersecurity. Again, since your users are your biggest weakness, they instantly become the hacker's biggest target. But on the other hand, when we are equipping our users with the right knowledge and the right tools, they in turn become our greatest defense. You need to communicate this with your users so that they understand that they are actually contributing significantly to the security of your organization. If you can even find some way to share with your users that by them adopting the cybersecurity culture mindset and actually putting it into practice, they are adding value to the organization. And I would say that would go a long way in terms of making it seem more enticing to actually get on board. Speaking of enticing, the second approach of trying to make cybersecurity fun is you could throw in some incentives for your users, specifically those who may be most proactive in implementing this culture. For example, you may award an Amazon gift card to your top 3 users who report the most phishing emails within a given year, just something simple like that. But I do think that in terms of building this culture, positive reinforcement will probably take you further than negative, like awarding someone a gift card for reporting the most emails, phishing emails in a year, as opposed to punishing a user for not reporting a phishing email. Positive reinforcement will probably take you further. It's what's worked for us. But whatever you can think of that will help sort of take away the perceived monotony with cybersecurity and really just encourage your users to start to take action. Incentives, rewards could go a long way. And then our final recommendation is that to get employee buy-in is that you train your users often. At the very, very bare minimum, we recommend that your users be required to go through a cybersecurity training at the time of onboarding, so when they're first hired. And during this process, they will be walked through and sign your organization's IT acceptable use policy. Hopefully you already have one of those. If not, we're going to touch on that again in a few slides, how you can begin to build one. But this should be happening at the time of onboarding, and also once a year. Sit your employees down and have a cybersecurity training. Maybe over a lunchtime conversation, try to make it more enticing, order wings or something. That's what we do. And wings and cybersecurity go really well together, actually. So additionally, so you've got training during the onboarding, you've got training annually. If your organization decides to run a simulation, like a phishing simulation, you'll definitely want to have a time of training following that simulation, and really just give the employees an opportunity to learn about what happened during that phishing attack or something else, and train them on how they can spot it next time. And so these are some of the things that have worked for us, but I'd love to hear your thoughts. Does anyone here currently do cybersecurity training within their company? If so, like what does this look like for you guys? Do you have any ideas that have worked for you? I'd love to hear your thoughts. Any ideas? None? That's okay. You may be thinking about this for the first time ever, and that's totally fine. So hopefully these tips that I've shared with you start to get the ideas flowing, and encourage you that maybe getting your employees on board is easier than it's made out to be, but that doesn't not make it a challenge, right? So if you have any ideas, keep typing them in the chat. Yeah, there's online cybersecurity training. KnowBe4 is a pretty popular one. So you don't even have to like bring in a cybersecurity, a cybersecurity professional to lead the training, or your IT staff. You could use an online option as well. Absolutely. All right, so again, I'd love to hear your thoughts. Feel free to keep typing them in the chat if you have them. Let's get into some specifics of what you should be training your users on. I have identified what I would consider to be here on the 3 most prevalent and most dangerous threats that your users should stay up to date with. Keep in mind that we are talking about training your basic users here. Your IT and security team should be knowledgeable of threats and remediations that extend well beyond this simple list. And they should tailor this list if they feel like there is a greater threat that requires training. So this is just my list, but feel free to tailor this as you see fit. The first threat that your employees must be trained to identify is social engineering. And social engineering is essentially the most basic way that I can describe it is it's the practice of manipulating someone into performing some action in order to obtain something. And it's a pretty vague definition, but that's because social engineering applies to more than just cybersecurity. But in our context, social engineering would apply to something like phishing, right? Someone sending you a fake email attempting to deceive you into clicking on a link or calling a phone number. And as a result, you performing that action will have some consequence. So phishing is an example of social engineering. There's another kind of social engineering that I wanted to point out briefly that I think you should be aware of, and that's whaling. And whaling is just a highly targeted phishing attack, primarily aimed at like your senior executives. So since these attacks are crafted for specific users, they can be much more difficult to spot. So keep that in mind, that your senior executives are the targets of very well crafted, very specific phishing emails that may look way different from the one that I showed you with the invoice.doc attachment, where, I mean, you can, if you're familiar with phishing emails, you can tell pretty quickly that something's not right with this. In some cases, there are highly targeted phishing emails sent directly to your company's senior leaders that are much more difficult to identify. So keep that in mind. Another type of social engineering, or rather what social engineering could look like, is it could look like an adversary trying to gain physical access to your facility by taking on the appearance of, say, a UPS associate, and then trying to make their way into the facility. Social engineering does not only apply to what we see on our computer, it could also apply to someone trying to break into our building and get into our server closet while looking like a legitimate, service technician or something. So all of these are examples of social engineering. We could talk for hours about all the different attacks that relate to social engineering, but you want to be sure to train your users on the basics when it comes to identifying these attacks. Again, these are just the most important things to me. The list extends well beyond what I would recommend here. But first, the most glaring and obvious sign of a social engineering attack is an urgent call to action. Someone saying, I need you to click on this link right away. I need you to open this attachment right away. Hey, I'm in a rush. Let me in the building. I only have an hour to do this. Those sorts of things. Urgency is the weapon of the social engineer. And so we need to keep that in mind. Additionally, if a sender or a visitor is unknown or unexpected, that also could be an indicator that a social engineering attack is taking place. So these are just the top two things. We have lots of recommendations for identifying social engineering that I'm actually going to talk about more here in a sec. On our LinkedIn page, we post a bunch of different cybersecurity tips describing ideas for the basic hygiene and a lot of the same stuff we're talking about. Feel free to go look at our LinkedIn page, Totem Technologies. We have a cyber tip for spotting social engineering. So you can listen to me talk about social engineering for 2 more minutes if you go watch that video. The second type of threats that you want to train your users on include virus or network attacks. These attacks still target your users. In fact, they almost always begin with something like a phishing email, but they tend to be the next step, meaning once they have deceived your users, once they have gotten you to click on that phishing link or gotten you to let them in the building, at that point, they are now looking to wreak havoc on your network. And the most significant example of this would be ransomware, like we were discussing earlier. Ransomware being a specific type of malware whose purpose is to encrypt your information and to spread and to hold that encrypted information for ransom, and basically demand that you pay that ransom. And as a result of doing so, they may or may not actually give you back your data. There's absolutely no guarantee that paying a ransom will get you your data back. So it's just a really ugly situation to be in, and hopefully not a situation that any of you ever find yourselves in. But I did include on the screen here one of the most well-known ransomware attacks in history, which was known as WannaCry. This is the actual screen that would appear once the WannaCry ransomware was launched. Note the laser pointer. Note the time left before the payment will be raised, the time remaining before the files will ostensibly be lost. Then also notice the payment that they demand payment in Bitcoin only. It's actually one of the reasons I'm not a huge fan of cryptocurrencies, because cryptocurrency is helping fuel the ransomware industry. But so keep in mind that virus network-based attacks, they typically start with a compromise of the human element, but this is ultimately the next step following like a social engineering attack. And so as a result, we need to also make sure that our networks, our workstations, et cetera, are also secure, so that in the event that an adversary does compromise the human element, we aren't completely lost, right? So there are other defensive measures we want to bring into place other than user training, but user training is the very first and arguably the thickest wall of defense that adversaries will need to overcome. We have a cyber tip on this as well, so feel free to go check that out on our LinkedIn page. Finally, the last threat that we would recommend that you train your users on is insider threat. And an insider threat is basically someone from within an organization, an employee within an organization who seeks to do harm to that organization. These attacks are, I'm pretty sure, less common than the first two, but on average, they are significantly more expensive. I shared a statistic on one of the first slides that the average cost of an insider threat event is around $15 million. Extremely, extremely dangerous. Probably the most difficult threats to actually spot, because if it's someone within an organization, they already sort of have that protection that there's no suspicion that there would be with a visitor or someone who's not an employee of the company, right? So take that element away, and they have a lot more runway to actually do some harm. There are a number of different indicators of insider threats that your users are going to want to be aware of. Things like job dissatisfaction, things like attempts to gain access to IT systems or sensitive information that they don't actually have control over. We have a handy tool that you can provide your users that detail all of these indicators. Our Computer Incident Response Aid, or CIRA, like I mentioned on the slide. This is actually what it looks like. It's a super handy, just front and back thing you can keep at your desk, and that your users can easily refer to in the event of some incident. I'm going to go over this again in a couple of slides, but there's some really helpful stuff on this that your users can keep close to them. But this is just a high-level overview of the threats that your users are going to want to be aware of. In this same vein, your users also need to be aware of the most important best practices or the preventative actions to take. I'm trying to give you the most helpful information right away, So I went ahead and put together a short list of what I would consider to be most important. But again, the list of best practices could be way, way longer. So feel free to tailor this how you see fit. This is just my idea. But keep in mind, again, that these best practices are for training your basic user. This is not everything that goes into a cybersecurity program. Your IT team should already be implementing other controls like those outlined in the Totem Top 10, in addition to these best practices. So, quick point of clarification, but let's go through these. First, we recommend that you always verify the identity of senders, visitors, vendors, etc. Anyone interacting with the company. Don't give them what they want unless you know that it is absolutely who they are claiming to be. Second, we recommend that you report suspicious events to your organization's security officer. If you do not have a security officer, we recommend appointing one, and training your users to, if they identify any suspicious activity, that they have this individual to report it to, and sort of just open up those channels of communication among your users. Third, we recommend that you avoid public, also known as open networks at all times. I said if traveling, but avoid open networks always is my mantra. They are not secure. There's a reason that they're open to anyone. And these networks are where a lot of really nasty things happen. So in the context of business, your users may need to travel. We recommend that they not connect to any open networks and instead use something like a hotspot to get internet access instead. So that's our third recommendation. Fourth, please don't connect personal devices to your corporate network. This just introduces a plethora of new risks that you're going to have to try and manage, because once it connects to that corporate network, it becomes part of your scope. And so just keep your personal devices off the corporate network. Set up something like a guest network specifically for visitors, for your employees who have a need to connect personal devices to the internet. Do not allow these onto the corporate network. Also, do not connect personal or removable media to corporate devices. So if you have your own USB or something at home, don't be slapping that into your company machine. Recommend that instead your company provide the removable media necessary to do your job. And so that way they're able to manage those devices. And then finally, enable multi-factor authentication wherever possible. We're going to spend a great deal of time talking about multi-factor authentication later in this series, because it actually gets its own control in the Totem Top 10. So we're going to talk lots about the benefits of multi-factor authentication, but super short list. Feel free to mention any other best practices that you think are important for users in the chat. But this was my short list, sort of to provide you with the best information right away. All right. So hopefully at this point, you've got all the information and you're ready to get started training your users right away. And if you are in that position, this is how I would recommend that you get started. Again, remember that this is our second control. Our first control was to know your assets. And I've said over and over again that know your assets is the first thing that you need to do. So before you start training your users, make sure that you know your assets. This should come after that. But first, I mentioned this earlier, you're going to want to put together an IT acceptable use policy. This is the document that's going to outline expectations for your users with your IT system assets and processes. and they will need to agree to abide by the acceptable use policy when they're first hired, and also really whenever the training occurs in case there are updates to the acceptable use policy, etc. This document is going to describe things like using company devices or working remotely, what the expectations are. So we have created, to help you with a lot of the legwork, we have created an IT acceptable use policy template that you can download for free on our free tools page. Did I stick the, yes, I did stick the link in the chat for the free tools page. You can find this on there. We hope that this is of some value to you. But this document is going to outline what your employees need to know for your organization's IT system expectations, and what processes, what sort of things they will agree to abide by. Like I mentioned, secure remote work, secure devices. You can feel free to tailor this however you want. These are our recommendations again, but hopefully this just helps with the initial legwork of not having to build out another, 5-page document. So feel free to check out the IT acceptable use policy on our free tools page. Second, we recommend that you grab a copy of our computer incident response aid. That's this guy. I mentioned this resource earlier. This is an awesome resource just to pass out to all of your users and have them keep it at their desks. It provides all the information for how users can identify and prevent some of the threats that we discussed earlier. And it also talks about indicators of some of these threats, things like indicators of a virus or network attack, indicators of insider threat, indicators of a suspicious email, right? So really helpful things that down to the most basic user should be trained to be able to identify and handle. So computer incident response aid also on our free tools page. Feel free to go grab yourself a copy of that. The next thing that I recommend that you do right away, sooner rather than later, is you launch a phishing simulation. We actually can help you with this if you want, but it's really imperative. I've said over and over and over again how dangerous phishing emails are. It is imperative that your users be able to spot these and know how to handle these, and like as soon as possible. So I'd recommend that you find someone out there who can run a phishing simulation for your organization. And then following that simulation, you hold a training of some sort where you can explain what we call the indicators of compromise, what sorts of things in the phishing email the users should have identified that would have made it clear it was a phishing email. And so phishing simulations, again, if you need help with that, we are more than happy to assist. Also, if you need any help with the user or administrator training, shoot me an email and we can chat about how Totem Technologies might be able to help. Well, this brings us to the end of our session on cybersecurity user training. I hope that you can see the value of this, especially in the context of like a phishing email. Thinking back to our phishing example a couple of weeks ago, the user training made the entire difference in whether or not that phishing email got anywhere. With trained users who can spot the attack and report it, that prevents a catastrophe from happening. And so we need our users, we need them to stay up to date on the most important threats, and we need them to be able to protect our businesses. This is not something that just our IT staff can do. This is, again, a collective effort. And the best way that we can go about doing this is to build our own cybersecurity culture. So I hope this is of some value to you as you start thinking about what this might look like in your organization. I would love to wrap this up with any other questions you guys might have as we close out our session for today. Let me just make sure I didn't miss anything. Any questions? Questions. I hope I'm not scary and you don't feel intimidated asking me questions. That's okay. Feel free to email me if you have questions. My email is on the screen there. You can also connect with me on LinkedIn if you'd like, whatever is more convenient for you. Please let us know if you need help with any of this stuff or if you have any additional questions. We really love talking about all this. We're more than happy to just sit down and help you sort of flesh out what this may mean for you and your team. So we want to be a resource for you in that regard. Yes, I am very scary. Thank you, Adam. All right. Well, if there are no questions, then we'll see you next week as we kick off with our very first technology, which is to whitelist software. So thanks again, everyone, and we'll see you next week.